The Dutch, under the leadership of Reverend Albertus van Raalte, were not the first white men nor the first Christians to occupy this area of West Michigan. Some of the early American frontiersmen and some of the Native Americans who inhabited our area before Van Raalte's arrival practiced their Christian faith. The most common Native Americans to be sighted in this area were the Potawatomi and Ottawa tribes. The Potawatomi tribe was the most prominent Native American tribe in southern Lower Michigan. They were primarily farmers. The Ottawa tribe, who wintered in our area, were hunter-gatherers. The 100 souls who arrived on the northern shore of Black Lake each winter were led by Chief Joseph Wakazu. They spent their time in our area hunting, fishing, trapping, and making maple syrup. At the end of the winter, they would return to the Traverse City area. The Ottawa tribe usually wintered on the north side of Black Lake until 1836, when white men established a colony called Superior near their winter camp. Superior survived 6 years until 1842, but the establishment of Superior destroyed the tribe's hunting grounds and maple sugar trees. In the 1820s and 1830s, the United States government's goal was to push all of the Native American tribes west of the Mississippi. So it began to pass laws and negotiate treaties to accomplish this goal. One of those laws or treaties was the Federal Indian Removal Policy. The Native Americans were given two choices. They could cede their lands to the government and move to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. If they did not want to relocate, they could choose to become civilized. This meant that they would live in colonies led by a Protestant cleric and teacher. They would send their children to the government school and begin to farm. If they agreed to become civilized, the government promised to provide farming tools and oxen, medication, and instructions on how to be a farmer. In 1837, Chief Joseph Wakazu knew he had to do something so his tribe was not permanently displaced. He discovered that in Allegan, where his tribe often went to trade, the Western Michigan Society to benefit the Indians had been established by the Congregationalists and Presbyterians. The society was being led by Judge John Kellogg. Judge Kellogg and his committee introduced Chief Wakazu to Reverend George Smith, who had just received his ordination and was eager to secure a ministerial position. After meeting Reverend Smith and his wife Arvila, the chief eagerly suggested that Reverend Smith become a teacher to his tribe. Both the West Michigan Society to Benefit the Indians and the Presbyterian Church agreed to the request. Reverend Smith eagerly approached his assignment. He was excited to have the opportunity to rid the Ottawa tribe members of their Catholic notions and to teach their children reading, writing, and arithmetic. But he found his assignment to be very challenging. The Native Americans had already been introduced to the Christian gospel from the point of view of French Catholic priests. It must have been very confusing to now be introduced to the Christian gospel from the viewpoint of a congregational minister. For many years, Catholic priests made visits to Michigan, where the fur trading had been going on. They taught the tribal members and served the sacraments. In the early 1830s, the Native Americans urged the bishop to station a priest among them. Father Bagaro was assigned and built chapels at Harbor Springs, Grand Rapids, and at the summer and winter camps of the Ottawa tribes. The priest took on the role of praying for the sick members, dispensing medications, and defending the interests of the tribe in government treaty negotiations. Another difficulty that Reverend Smith experienced was that he had a great deal of trouble learning the Algonquin language. He had to hire an interpreter for the first 8 years of his mission work. Chief Wakazoo supported Reverend Smith, but kept in mind that his first priority was really to the members of his tribe. In 1839, 8 years before Van Raalte arrived, Reverend Smith moved to northern Allegan County, where he set up his mission. The mission was named Old Wing Mission after Chief Wakazoo's recently deceased relative. Chief Wakazoo decided to take advantage of the government treaties and was given money to purchase land in this area. He purchased 1,360 acres east of the present day Columbia Avenue and west of Country Club Road, south of 32nd Street to 48th Street. Reverend Smith had recommended this particular land site. It was closer to Allegan, where the Native Americans traded. It was closer to Avila's relatives. It had excellent soil, and it was away from the lake, where tribal members were influenced by the fur traders. 2 years later, in 1841, Smith received monies from the Presbyterian Church to build a small school where he could teach the children the 3 R's and the adult men the techniques of farming. 3 years later, construction on a 2-story framed house began for Reverend Smith. Isaac Fairbanks, a government land agent, built the Smiths' framed house and then built a cabin for his family a few hundred yards away. The mission house still stands in Holland today. It was a lonely, difficult life for Smith, his wife, and their family. Reverend Smith and his wife, Avila, lost 5 young children. It was reported that between 1840 and 1842, only 3 white women visited the mission. A disappointment for Smith was that few members of the tribe attended his services regularly. They did not seem interested in Presbyterian services. They just continued their nomadic lifestyle, and many had problems with alcohol. It would be easier for the Native Americans to farm if their village was on the same side of Black Lake as their land. It would also be easier to access lumber from the Superior sawmill if a port was built on the south side of Black Lake. Judge Kellogg gave the mission 1 acre of land on the south side of Black Lake. It was called the Landing. The landing was located where the Heinz Pickle Factory is today. The Native Americans were glad for the port, but they also had an ulterior motive for encouraging this development. They intended to plant a rival Catholic mission on the site. Chief Wakazoo encouraged Smith to ask Judge Kellogg to sell the 15 acres adjacent to the landing. Kellogg agreed, but it soon became clear the intent of the tribal members. They built a chapel on the land, and a priest consecrated a burial ground there. Tribal members were encouraged to set up their wigwams at the landing rather than on the Old Wing mission grounds. On the Sundays that Father Viskowski, who served the Catholics in Grand Rapids, visited, Reverend Smith did not have many who attended his services. Reverend Smith encouraged the tribal members to break out of their traditional ways, but Father Viskowski encouraged the opposite. Most of the tribal members sided with the father. They liked the Catholic rituals, the statues of the saints, and ideas of confessing one's sins so they could repeat them. Father Viskowski was popular among the tribal members. He was handsome, wore clerical robes, and spoke fluent Algonquin. Although disappointed in this development, Smith welcomed him warmly. Chief Wakazoo continued to remain supportive to Reverend George Smith until his death in 1845, but many of his followers turned to Father Viskowski. Isaac Fairbanks, who had been hired by Reverend George Smith in 1844 to work as a government agent teaching the Native Americans farming techniques, built a cabin for his family across the road from the Smiths' frame house. On New Year's Eve, 1846, a knock on the door of the Fairbanks cabin brought enormous changes to the lives of the Native Americans and white frontiersmen in our area. When Isaac Fairbanks answered the door, he came face to face with a stranger, inappropriately dressed for the wilderness. Judge Kellogg from Allegan, an Indian guide, and George Harrington, a friend of Fairbanks and employee of Judge Kellogg. The stranger was Reverend Albertus van Raalte, who had come from the Netherlands looking for a suitable place to establish a Christian colony in the New World. For 3 weeks, Van Raalte, Harrington, and Kellogg tramped about the area. Van Raalte was impressed. There was the potential for a harbor, wonderful trees, several waterways, and fertile ground. At the end of his visit, he purchased several thousand acres of land for a good price and went back to Detroit to arrange for his group to come to this area. Who was this stranger? And why was he here? We need to go way back in time to understand the situation. A religious movement known as the Reformation swept through Europe in the 1500s. Its leaders disagreed with the Roman Catholic Church on certain religious issues and criticized the Church's great power and wealth. These people broke away from the Catholic Church and founded various Protestant churches. Some of the prominent leaders of the Protestant movement were Martin Luther, who started the Lutheran Church, and John Wesley, who started the Methodist Church, and John Calvin, who started the Presbyterian tradition. The roots of the Reformed Protestant Dutch Church can be traced back to John Calvin. It became the largest Christian denomination in the Netherlands. In 1816, the King of the Netherlands made the church a department of the government, so gained control over what was preached and taught in the churches. What was going on in the Netherlands in the mid 1800s when the stranger appeared at Isaac Fairbanks' door? Now that the Dutch Reformed Church was a department of the government, people questioned whether the ministers were teaching the true gospel. The government was controlling what the churches were doing. The Dutch were used to singing the Psalms in their services, and now hymns written by man were introduced. People separated from the church and began to hold services in their homes. They were known as separatists or seceders. People were persecuted for criticizing the church. They were fined, they were assigned to quarter soldiers in their homes, they were imprisoned, and on top of that, they were experiencing a very poor economy. Dutch Calvinist Dr. Albertus van Raalte had separated from the Dutch Reformed Church. In the summer of 1846, Van Raalte became seriously ill with typhus. The prognosis was grim. He decided to make a bargain with God that if he was allowed to survive, he would lead immigrants to the New World and establish a Christian colony. Well, he survived. In the fall of 1846, he led a group of 60 men, women, and children on a 54-day voyage from Rotterdam to New York. He shared with a close friend that his heart ached at the thought of leaving his homeland. One of Van Raalte's first priorities when establishing this new colony was setting up worship services for the colonists. The colonists who came with Van Raalte understood that the colony would be governed by ethics and morals laid out by the Dutch Reformed Church. This they agreed to before they ventured out with Van Raalte to the New World. At first, worship services were held outdoors at Van Raalte's house on Fairbanks Avenue. The pulpit was a table, and Van Raalte stood on a stump when he preached because he was really short. The worshippers sat on logs. As winter approached, the colonists were concerned about where they would worship. In the fall of 1847, the immigrants built a log church on the cemetery grounds. It was located on 16th Street, what is now Pilgrim Home Cemetery. It was quite a large log cabin, 35 by 60 feet. It held 225 people. Two rooms, a large room for the sanctuary, and a smaller room for Sunday school and meetings. Two cook stoves were used for heating. In 1848, a road was laid out from Van Raalte's house to the log church. That road was Fairbanks Avenue. So many immigrants continued to arrive from the Netherlands that it was not long before the congregation began planning to build a larger church. The first Dutch Reformed Church of Holland, Van Raalte's Church, or as we know it, Pillars Church, was completed in 1856, 10 years after the Dutch arrived in this area. The settlers who chose to settle in the Holland colony knew that the colony had been established for Reformed believers to provide religious freedom and economic opportunities. The church was the center of the colony, and the elders and deacons were in charge of the morals and faith within the colony. This created a situation where many settlers considered themselves insiders and a minority were looked upon as outsiders. Before an official governing body for the colony was established, the male adults in the colony met to discuss issues facing the colony. They called themselves the People's Assembly. They weighed such issues as how to observe the Sabbath and the use of alcohol. It was decided that the schooners docked in the harbor were prohibited from unloading their goods on Sunday, even though the ships might be in danger of being destroyed by heavy waves. No hard alcohol was allowed on colony property. It had been written in the deeds for the land that hard alcohol was not allowed, except for medicinal purposes. Van Raalte's vision for the colony was that the members of the colony would live in peace and harmony with each other. However, not all the settlers agreed with the decisions of the cleric and the People's Assembly. There seems to be no place on earth that is exempt from politics. Let's look at some of the political issues that affected the settlers during the beginning times of the Holland colony. In the spring of 1848, 15 months after his arrival, Van Raalte encouraged the outlining Reformed Protestant Dutch churches to meet periodically together to discuss mutual issues. The group that formed was called a classis. The purpose of the classis would be that the churches would work together rather than competing with each other. The churches from Zeeland, Graskop, Drenthe, Friesland, and Overijssel joined Holland to form the classis. Examples of the issues of mutual concern that were discussed would be what confessions and church order would be used in the worship services. How soon could one marry after losing a spouse? How long should elders and deacons serve? These issues caused disagreements in individual churches, as well as between different Reformed churches in the classis. A year later, in 1849, The Holland Classis was approached by ministers from the Reformed Protestant Dutch churches on the East Coast to join them under one umbrella. The Dutch Reformed Church was well established on the East Coast because its beginnings started in the 1600s when the Dutch came to the New World to establish trade and explore new territories. Through the generations, the ministers of the Reformed tradition had become Americanized. Members of the churches in the Holland classes were hesitant to join the Eastern Dutch Reformed churches because they had just come from the Netherlands, where all of the Reformed churches had come under one umbrella, and it had not been satisfactory. Some settlers argued that the Holland classes joined the East Coast churches because so many of these ministers and their churches had supported Van Raalte and his band of seceders as they traveled west to the Lake Michigan shores. For Van Raalte and his people, it meant a link with the American church, with experience, a seminary, and people who could offer advice and financial support. The East Coast churches were established and had more money. The Holland colony was poor. Others argued that East Coast churches had had contact with many other denominations, and so some of their traditions and preaching had been affected by these experiences. Did the parishioners hear the true gospel from the pulpit in those churches? Members of the East Coast churches attended revivals, socialized with the broader community, and joined the Freemasons. The perception of the Holland colonists was that the churches on the East Coast did not truly understand the separatist movement and how it affected the colonists when they lived in the Netherlands. The East Coast churches favored the merger because they wanted to expand their denomination on the Western Front. To ease the fears of the settlers in the Holland colony, the East Coast churches promised if a union took place, any church could step away from the association at any time. The churches individually voted, and it was approved, and so the Holland classes came under the umbrella of the Reformed Dutch Protestant churches on the East Coast. This was known as the Union of 1850. After the signing of the Union of 1850, conversation continued about whether or not this was a good idea. 7 years later, in 1857, 5 congregations removed themselves from the Holland classes and the Union. They formed their own classes called the True Dutch Reformed Church. This was the beginning of the Christian Reformed denomination. The motto of this denomination was "In isolation is our strength." As a result, each village had a Dutch Reformed and Christian Reformed church, often right next to each other. Pillar Church was the original church established by the Van Raalte's congregation. It was known as Van Raalte's Church or First Reformed. Look at the top of the steeple. Dutch Reformed churches often put a rooster on top of their churches instead of a cross like the Catholics do. Before Jesus was crucified, he told Peter, his favorite disciple, that Peter would deny knowing Jesus 3 times before the cock crowed. Peter did deny him 3 times, and the cock crowed. The rooster is there to remind us that when we deny Christ, we need to confess our sin and ask for forgiveness. Another interpretation is that the rooster crowing at dawn symbolizes that Christ brings us out of darkness into the light. The 6 pillars of the church are original. They are made of staves similar to barrel staves. Barrel staves are narrow strips of wood forming the sides of the barrel. To form the pillars, the staves were placed vertically. The center of each pillar is hollow. There are original floor beams that run the length of the church, which are over 100 feet long. Of course, the church has gone through several renovations. In the 1950s, the church was raised up and a basement was dug underneath. During construction, the congregation continued to hold worship services. In the original church, men sat on the two outer sides. Women and children sat in the middle pews. There were doors on either side of the church. The men could use those doors during the middle of the service to leave and check on their horses. The older boys sat in the back of the church and often caused a ruckus. Sometimes the minister had to stop and reprimand them. Children were given peppermints at the start of each sermon point to keep them quiet. The morning services lasted about 3 hours, with Van Raalte preaching a 3-point sermon on a topic of his choice. Then there was a lunch break, after which congregants returned at 2 p.m. for another service based on the Heidelberg Catechism, the basic doctrine of the Reformed Church. In the first 50 years of Van Raalte's church, services were always preached in Dutch. Hymns were not sung in the services. Congregants sang the Psalms from the scripture instead. In the 1800s, there was a common custom in many churches to rent out the pews. This was a way of raising money for the church. Sometimes auctions were held and the pew went to the highest bidder. Other times, a sliding scale was used, with the more desirable pews going to those more wealthy. Sometimes a lottery was held as a fair way to determine who had what pew. The pews were rented for a year, and the family could bring pillows and blankets to make their pew more comfortable. Poor folks were at times assigned a pew with no rental fee. Even though Van Raalte's congregation was very poor, records show that they were mission minded. They gave to the Jews in Jerusalem, missions in China, flood relief in Poland, and a seminary in the Netherlands. There is still evidence of the mission commitment today. In January of 1866, Elder Michael Clapper, a local Methodist evangelist and stonemason, began to hold revival meetings in a room above a Holland saloon. At first there was opposition and ridicule, but the stonemason kept holding the meetings. More and more people began to attend, and soon the meetings were moved to larger locations. Eventually, Van Raalte's church was approached to offer their facility. At first, they refused, but so much fuss occurred. How could a church refuse revival meetings when the Holy Spirit was obviously at work in the lives of many people during those meetings? Eventually, the church relented and offered their space. First Reformed Church benefited because a large number of people joined the church, mostly due to the preaching of the stonemason. Following the death of Van Raalte in 1876, another separation took place, only this time it was within the First Reformed Church congregation. The most volatile issue was whether or not a member of the church could also belong to the Freemasons. The Freemasons were originally a group in the Old World, composed of men who did masonry work. They used a secret code so only members could attend the meeting. In the 1700s, it expanded its membership and formed societies oriented towards social, religious, scientific matters, and anyone could join. It was viewed by some as a universal religion. Some who joined wanted social, others wanted intellectual stimulation, while others just liked the idea of a secret society. There was a controversy in the churches of many denominations over the issue of membership in the Freemasons. It was problematic for Van Raalte's church because they had united with the East Coast churches in 1850. These churches were more liberal and allowed their ministers and members to belong to the Freemasons. The issue of membership in the Freemasons finally came to a head at Van Raalte's church in 1882 after the death of Van Raalte. A vote of the congregation was held, and 80% of the congregation voted against membership. In 1882, the 80% decided to join with the emerging Christian Reformed Church. They seized the building, locked its doors with chains, and grasping axe handles, defended it against their fellow congregants. They renamed the church the Ninth Street Christian Reformed Church. The 20% were not allowed into the church. The minority group began to worship at Hope College. They retained the name of First Reformed Church. 3 years later, in 1885, they bought a lot at the corner of Ninth and Central, within the same block and within sight of their old church. Their new church building on that lot was dedicated in 1886. In 1920, an expansion to the front of the building, facing Ninth Street, was added. In 1963, First Reformed built a new church on the corner of State and 26th Street, which is their present location. Their old church building on the corner of 9th and Central Avenue was used for a while for other purposes and later torn down. The Holland Museum has some of the stained glass windows from that church. The Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church maintain separate identities and cultures. Marriages between the two groups would at times split the family. The Christian Reformed Church developed a strong network of Christian schools, while the Reformed Church supported public schools. The issue of women who held elder or deacon positions within the church, or women pastors, was also a divisive issue. Pillar Church gradually declined in membership. The church had to decide whether to stop being a congregation and sell the building or give it to the city because of its historical significance. In 2012, it was decided that Pillar Church would become a joint congregation of the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church, calling a pastor from each denomination. Since that time, the church has grown, serving the students on the campus of Hope College and the residents of Holland. It is once again a vibrant church. A new baptismal font was built. Surrounding the wooden baptism bowl is a big chain. The legs of the base of the stand are representative of axe handles. It's placed at the entrance to the church, now welcoming all who come. Education was important to Van Raalte and the Dutch immigrants. Van Raalte said education was the anchor of hope for the people in the future. That is why the symbol for Hope College is the anchor. Van Raalte tried to establish both public and Christian schools in the new colony, but he was not successful. Children were busy helping their parents, families were struggling, and there was no money for private education. It was difficult, too, to find teachers. Van Raalte sought out the Reformed Church leaders in the East to help. Teachers arrived from the East Coast and eventually were able to establish educational opportunities for the young people in the new colony. The teachers who arrived were Dutch Americans whose families had been in the New World for several generations. They all spoke English. Church services were held in Dutch, and most of them could not understand that language. In 1855, a small group of American teachers began to hold Sunday services in English. 5 years later, in 1860, a plan was made for the organization of a new church whose services would be in English. This would accommodate the American teachers who arrived from the East Coast, the Americans who were moving into the colony, and the young Dutch people who were learning English and could possibly drift away from the Reformed churches whose services were in Dutch. Van Raalte donated 4 lots, or an acre of land, for the new church. For some reason, the plan was stalled in 1861. The Methodists filled the void by organizing the first English speaking church in the colony. Finally, in 1862, Van Raalte and Philip Phelps, the first president of Hope College, implemented the 1860 plan, and the Second Dutch Protestant Reformed Church was born. It would be the second English speaking church in the colony after the Methodist Church. The church building for the new church was completed in December of 1864. It was built on the land donated by Van Raalte between 10th and 11th Street, just west of River Avenue. It was a wooden frame structure 35 by 60 feet facing 10th Street. In 1866, the church was renamed Hope Church. Membership in the new church increased, although it attracted few Americans who were coming from the East Coast. They preferred the Methodist Episcopal Church instead of trying to learn the doctrines of the Dutch Reformed Church. The Holland fire of 1871 destroyed Hope Church. The congregation worshiped for 2 years at the Hope College Chapel Gymnasium as the church was being rebuilt. Before the fire, the congregation had built a parsonage. They had built this in 1869 at a cost of $3,000. It survived the fire. Today, it is located at 195 West 10th Street. It was moved there in 1909. The new church was dedicated in 1874, 3 years after the fire had occurred. It was of rural Gothic style, its sanctuary could hold 500 worshipers, and it served the congregation for 28 years. It later became the parish house. The only thing left of the 1874 church was the bell tower. The new church building faced 11th Street rather than 10th Street like the original church. It is said that the parishioners did not want to have to listen to the booming voice of the Methodist Episcopal minister from across 10th Street. One morning, shortly after the new building was dedicated, a village cow decided that the church lawn looked more appetizing than the grass in the market square. The village cow was wearing a bell, and as he moved, the noise of the bell distracted the preacher. The preacher asked the custodian to drive the cow away. Instead, the custodian walked the cow around the church for the next half an hour, driving the preacher crazy. Hope Church in the 1800s had a wealthier congregation. The average pew rental was $250 for the year. Congregants were open to change. They loved singing. In 1883, the 20-voice choir led the congregation in learning hymns from the new hymn book. Remember, in Van Raalte's church, they sang only the Psalms from the Bible. The minister encouraged loosening ties with the Dutch language and culture and becoming Americanized. Perhaps some of the worshipers were a little too liberal. The Holland City News carried an announcement for the parishioners of Hope Church. Persons attending Hope Church are requested to remain through the entire service. No individual should leave any church until the close of worship, unless something special makes it necessary for him to withdraw. From beginning to end, the attention of the congregation should remain undisturbed. Hope Church has the same look today as it did in 1901. when a new sanctuary was added on the south side of the building. In 1867, Van Raalte's church was becoming overcrowded. It was decided the congregation of Dutch immigrants would be divided geographically. Those living on the east side of Central Avenue would continue to worship at the original church. Those living on the west side of Central Avenue would establish a new church called Third Protestant Dutch Reformed Church. It was thought that having two immigrant Reformed churches in the colony would have a greater impact than having one large Dutch Protestant Reformed church. Although the colony was composed of mostly Dutch immigrants, there were Americans moving in and starting other churches. Van Raalte wanted the Reformed churches to remain dominant in the new colony. Which church should Van Raalte serve? To avoid conflict or hard feelings, he decided to retire, and two new ministers would be called. Van Raalte donated 4 lots, and the original church donated the money to build the church. The sanctuary was used for only 3 years before it was destroyed in the Great Fire, which swept through Holland in October of 1871. The fire had started south of the colony, and the first alarm came from the third church bell on Sunday afternoon. The church was completely destroyed, but a young boy named George Dahlman had run back into the church and carried out the Dutch pulpit Bible. It is now a treasured reminder of the early church and displayed in the foyer of the third church today. Even though members suffered great personal loss due to the fire, the congregation began constructing a second sanctuary in 1872. But on January 2, 1873, a severe wind destroyed the newly raised framework, resulting in starting the building over again. The new building was finally completed in 1874. Note that there is no steeple on the 1874 building. The bell tower and steeple were added in 1891. The architect J.R. Klein described the new Carpenter's Gothic building this way. The woodwork outside is painted and sanded with a light gray sandstone color, with trimmings and cornices a brown sandstone. The windows are of a stained glass, including the front and chancel windows. The sanctuary will seat 700 people comfortably. The gallery above the classroom is capable to seat 50 people, with sufficient room left for a large organ. When the new church was completed, there was no money left for the pews. The pastor of the Constantine, Michigan Reformed Church loaned the church $500 for the purchase of the pews. Those pews are still used today. Notice the length of each pew. It reminds us of the height of some of the trees in our area during the later 1800s. The numbers are still on the ends of the pews and remind us of the days when pews were rented as a means of providing funds for the annual budget of the church. St. Nicholas Collegiate Church was a Reformed Protestant Dutch church in Midtown Manhattan. It was founded in 1872 and demolished in 1948. It was Manhattan's oldest congregation at that time. Theodore Roosevelt attended this church, and his memorial service was held here. The members of the church wanted an appropriate home for the pulpit and the chancel furniture. The beautiful, ornate Victorian pulpit furniture had been carved by Italian craftsmen in 1936. These craftsmen were well known for their work in many European cathedrals. No nails were used in the construction of this furniture. The pulpit had been a gift to St. Nicholas Church from Mrs. Robert Todd Lincoln, the daughter-in-law of President Lincoln. Third Reformed Church was chosen as a new home for these pieces because of its Gothic architecture. The altar cloth was made by Susie Van Kuyken of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The design allowed the beautiful hand carvings to be visible. Third Church as a congregation became more Americanized than First Church. Its first minister, Henry Utterwick, and leading elder Isaac Capon promoted this. They sang hymns and started a choir. They approved of revivals, and they promoted public education and supported the temperance movement. Even though they were open to Americanization, two things really bothered them. There were the matters of Sunday observances and social issues. In 1905, the new minister refused to drive his new car on Sunday. Was it enough for congregants to attend only the morning services rather than the evening services as well? Two painful controversies affected Third Church as well as First Church. One was the issue of a church member belonging to the Freemasons. The other controversy was holding worship services in English. The church was the first Dutch immigrant church to introduce services in English. One can imagine how controversial this was. They started with an evening service to compete with Hope Church and tried to keep their young people from going over to Hope Church in the evenings. Most Reformed churches did not make the change to English services until 10 years after World War I. For those of you who are interested in history or historical places, you are encouraged to attend a Sunday service at Third Reformed Church. Sit on an original pew from 1874. Marvel at the pillars and arches, and stare in awe at the hand-carved Victorian pulpit and chancel furniture. In 1857, 5 congregations from the outlying Holland area removed themselves from both the Holland classes that Van Raalte had organized and the Union of 1850 with the East Coast churches. They formed their own classes called the True Dutch Reformed Church. This was the beginning of the Christian Reformed denomination. The motto of the Christian Reformed denomination was "In isolation is our strength." Van Raalte worked diligently to keep his congregation together in the village of Holland. Those living in Holland who were drawn to the True Dutch Reformed Church journeyed to Graskop each Sunday for services. But they got tired of going all the way to Graskop and began holding services in their homes. In 1865, 8 years after village residents began to be associated with Graskop, True Dutch Reformed Church, there was a movement to start a congregation in the village of Holland. Harm Slag, a shipbuilder and member of the group, offered a lot for sale on the corner of Central and 11th Street. At first, a school building was moved to the lot and used for worship. The following year, a new church building was built. The new community had a very difficult time finding a minister who strictly adhered to the major Reformed doctrines, the Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Canons of Dort. Finally, they resorted to calling pastors from the Netherlands. Most of those ministers responding to the call came from the northern provinces of the Netherlands, where pastors and parishioners were more conservative. Ministers in the southern provinces tended to be more liberal in their theology and had more in common with the Dutch Reformed churches like Van Raalte's. One of the issues that faced the new church was whether or not to purchase fire insurance. At first they did, and then later they canceled the policy. They had no insurance when the Holland fire of 1871 occurred. The fire came within 1 block of the church, so the church was not destroyed. The elders of the church ran a tight ship. Personal issues and missteps of individual parishioners were policed and addressed by the elders, and sometimes they were brought up before the entire congregation. The underage young men in the congregation were often out of control and quite rude. Members of the consistory spent a lot of time trying to solve this problem. There was no organ in the church for a long time because an organ was considered a worldly theater instrument. In 1887, the consistory voted to use wine with a weaker concentration of alcohol because some of the parishioners were getting woozy after communion. The formation of Christian schools continued to be an issue for the new church and denomination. In 1899, the church ministered to 1,700 people. It continued to have the largest congregation in the city until the 1970s, when the megachurches such as Central Wesleyan and Christ Memorial gained more members. The congregation of the church kept increasing, and so in 1901 a larger church was built on the same site. The current church building was completed in 1953. When Reverend Albertus Van Raalte came to this area to look over the land, he and Judge Kellogg, along with their Indian guide, were brought to this area from Allegan by George Harrington. George Harrington was an employee of Judge Kellogg and eventually moved his family to the Holland colony. When they arrived in this area, they were welcomed by Isaac Fairbanks, the agricultural agent who had built the mission house and a cabin for himself and his family nearby. They stayed with the Fairbanks family as Van Raalte explored the area. Both Fairbanks and Harrington were Methodists. However, they spent 14 years worshiping with Van Raalte, even though they knew little Dutch. They did not enjoy singing the Psalms and found the theology of the Reformed Church quite different. In 1855 and then again in 1860, Van Raalte and others began to discuss plans to organize a second church in the colony that would offer services in English. Plans were delayed, and George Harrington and Isaac Fairbanks took advantage of the delay. In 1861, they, with the help of a few others, organized the first English speaking church in the colony. The Methodist Episcopal Church was only the second organized church in the village. It started with 11 members. The Dutch English speaking church, Second Reformed, or Hope Church, was not established until 1862, a year later. At first, services were held every fourth Sunday. The Methodists were part of a circuit along with Fillmore, Hamilton, and Ventura. A circuit rider led the worship services. This continued from 1861 to 1866. The small group met in the log fire hall on property that is now part of Centennial Park. In 1869, the small group of worshipers built a log chapel on 10th Street, where the Methodists are located today. The new church grew and it was decided to build a larger church. They built a white frame structure, and as it was nearing completion, the Holland fire of 1871 destroyed it. A formal worship service had never been held in that building. The Methodists started rebuilding immediately and completed their second building in 1872. This time they chose to use brick. The congregation continued to grow, so it was decided to renovate the 1872 building and enlarge it. The work was completed, and the dedication took place in June of 1900. On February 6, 1901, 7 months after the dedication, the church again was destroyed by fire. A third church was built in 1902. This one lasted longer. A fire in the dead of winter in 1979 burned down that building. A fourth church was built in 1981 and is still being used today. The Americans who settled in the colony preferred the Methodist Church because they were not interested in learning the creeds of the Reformed Church. The Methodists were quite different than the Dutch, who had so recently come from the Netherlands. They totally agreed that members of the Methodist Church could also be members of the Freemasons. Even in the early days, they decorated a Christmas tree in the sanctuary and had Santa arrive at the Christmas program. The Methodist Episcopal Church became one of the largest and most influential churches in Holland. In 1866, a few Americans in the colony got together and shared their desire to have an Anglican liturgical service that would include gestures, symbols, ritual, and prayers that were spoken or sung. This is often referred to as High Church and is related to Catholic Christianity. Grace Episcopal Church was organized in 1868, but it was very difficult to attract members. There were few Americans in the colony, and many of them chose to worship at the Methodist Church that gave little emphasis to rituals, sacraments, and the authority of the clergy. The colony was also dominated by the Dutch Reformed churches. Their first church building was a private school building located where the Masonic Temple is today on 10th Street next to the museum. That first church was burned down in the Holland Fire of 1871. A very ornate new church was built at the corner of Pine and 11th in 1873, but that burned down in 1886. A third building, not as ornate, was built in 1889 and still stands today. It now belongs to Holland Community Theater and is located on 9th Street, just west of River. In 1954, the congregation built a fourth church on Michigan Street, and that is where they worship today. In Robert Zweringa's summary of the Reformed churches in Holland, in his historical trilogy Holland, Michigan, he asks, "What has Van Raalte wrought? Did this American Moses accomplish his purpose of leading his persecuted followers across the ocean to establish a Christian colony, a God-centered community in the American wilderness that would be salt and light for the American people?" In the first 20 years of the colony's existence, Van Raalte and the other pastors and elders of the believing community worked to ensure that religion permeated every aspect of life in this new colony. During that time, 5 churches were established. 4 with the Reformed doctrine, which was Van Raalte's goal. Today, the Christian faith still permeates the city of Holland. We have 132 churches in the Holland community, representing 36 denominations. There is still a strong presence of the Reformed tradition, with 19 Reformed churches and 19 Christian Reformed churches.